This is the third video in the series about conceptual modeling. In the last video we talked about entities and began talking about attributes. Now let's talk some more about different kinds of attributes, remembering that attributes are properties of entities. So every attribute has a domain, which is the set of all the values that are legal for that attribute. An attribute domain is often just a data type, like integer or Boolean, maybe date, maybe variable string or fixed length string. It can also be an actual set of legal values, like all the countries or these particular 5 pets that I've shown in this set. So every attribute has a domain that you note for that attribute. Then every entity set has some attribute or possibly group of attributes that together form a unique identifier. So we have this idea of a key attribute, which is a unique value for every instance in every possible entity set for some entity type. And it's important that there is some way to uniquely identify each of the entities in the entity type. Sometimes there's multiple attributes that will be unique, but you look at calling a key attribute, maybe multiple ones, like a car can have a license plate number and a vehicle ID number, but usually you call a key attribute something that's really a natural identifier for the thing. For example, a clinic in a company of clinics, of course, the name would naturally be unique and be the identifier of the clinic, whether it's the downtown clinic or the Riverside clinic. So here I've shown name as the key attribute by underlining it. Obviously, the phone number would be unique for each clinic, but we don't really think of phone number as the identifier of that clinic. So here we're just showing name. Now, sometimes you have an attribute that's composed of different smaller parts, and you depict it this way, like we've shown here, and you think of it this way because these component parts are important individually. So addresses, on forms often have street, city, country separate. And they're separate because they're treated differently. Countries can come from a list, street numbers maybe can be looked up, and so on. Maybe a phone number could also be composite if you took the country code as one component and the rest of the number as the other component. So you show this to say address is the property, but actually we treat each of these component parts are important. It's always possible that you just leave this part out and connect each one on its own too. Now sometimes we have attributes where they're not simple attributes, which are ones that have a single value per instance. Maybe there's ones where there's multiple values for the same instance. For example, a patient, the same patient, might have multiple phone numbers. Their phone number at their house, their mobile phone number, and their work phone number at their desk at work. So phone number is an attribute that may have multiple values for the same instance. And if so, we show it like this, with a double line on the oval. And that's a very special case, a multi-valued attribute. Oh, sorry. Finally, we have this idea of a derived attribute. A derived attribute is an attribute that you want to show in your model. It's an important property of your entity, but that value can actually be calculated from some other information in the data model. The obvious one is age. Age is a very important property of the patient because it's used, in a lot of medical issues. The age is very important, but age can be calculated from another attribute of a patient, which is their date of birth. So you might show age because it's important, but you show that it can be derived by putting the dotted line around it. Sometimes the calculation might be more complicated. For example, if your system is about users who post posts on some social media, maybe the number of posts is an important property of the user. So the number of posts can be calculated by counting the number of posts, but you want to indicate that that property of the user is somehow important, and you would put it user and number of posts and show it as derived because you can get it by counting. So those are some of the different types of attributes, and the next video will move on to relationships.